Mode. Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome you all. We are starting this webinar, Access to Medicine and International Governance in Post-Pandemic COVID-19. From the CISS, receive greetings from our General Secretary, Dr. Gibran Ramirez Reyes, and on behalf of Dr. Daisy Corrales Diaz, our Director of the CISS. So, by the same token, we welcome the members of the American Commission of Judicial and Social, Hector Santana, Mr. Hector Francisco Antonio Aristi, Mr. Carlos Alberto Rodriguez Moran, Mr. Gilbert Alfaro Morales, Mr. Miguel Ángel Loja, Mrs. Marlene Desiree Berroa Martich, Mr. Emmanuel de Arauja Dantas. Dr. Jorge Orbelin, who's with us today. He's a researcher, specialist of the American Commission, Legal and Social, who's going to coordinate this, and me, Laura Vidal, who is the coordinator of the research program of American Commissions of Social Security. The purpose of this activity is to give a space where we could debate the advancements in models of research and development from the point of view of access to medicine and international governments issues, considering the management of the rights of intellectual property of medicine and taking advantage of the pandemic. The affectation of health caused by the pandemic has given this new problem of access to medicine, which is not a new conflict. It gives us the chance to talk about this problem from a different point of view, whose core would be the sustainability of health, globally speaking. From the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen a raise in the prices of medicines in three different categories. First, we have medicaments for the use of COVID-19, the clinical trial medicine, and those used for chronic diseases. Some of these medicines that are used to treat non-severe COVID-19 symptoms have raised their prices over 40%. Besides that, we have a lack of medicines for patients in severe conditions, and we have an increase of price up to 60% in sedative medicine. In the last months, we have had a raise in the price of 44 drugs for hospitalized patients. The UN Office for the Service of Projects for the Caribbean, Latin America, presented on June the 15th this year the Regional Observatory of Prices of Drugs that really looks for establishing a fair price range in the market through transparent and immediate information. One of the innovative drugs that we have now in clinical trials for the treatment of COVID-19 has had a fluctuation of price of 400%, which the media price of this drug has increased at 30%. In the media of transaction, the prices in 9 countries in the region. On the other side, we have also raised the prices of medicines of chronic medicines, such as diabetes, hypertension, and medicines related to mental health. We have a public management which is fair to have regional efforts for the well-being of the population. With this webinar, we have Dr. Orbelin from the CISA research group, who's a judicial science doctor. He has 2 master's degrees in intellectual property and civil right for the University of La Habana. He is a law advocate, and he has a postdoctorate in law in Paso Profundo, Brazil, and the UNAM legal research. Dr. Orbelin will introduce each and every one of the speakers. He will give a little background of them, and we'll welcome him, and we thank you for your participation. So before everything, good morning. Thank you very much for being here, speakers, and the people listening to us in the virtual networks through YouTube and other communication channels. So what really impacts us and has led us to this topic is not only because it's something that really worries Latin American region, but it's also we have to think a different way on how we can actually conceive the management of intellectual property and the production of drugs generally globally. So we can see today there are several models or ways that are alternative and that may be possible. Traditionally, we have had a single way that we have accepted under certain conditions has been imposed. What we have lived with COVID, we can actually call a revealed truth, something that really happened that was present in our countries, but it was not only clear all the time. So we do not only want to refer to the vaccine of COVID, but we're also thinking of alternatives and thinking of governability, internationally speaking. So that's the real question that we ask ourselves. Is it possible to establish an alternative model in drug management for the poorest? Is it possible an alternative model not only consider the innovation, but also things like accessing and the right to health? I think the most important in all this kind of relationship or debate is mainly to consider concepts like cooperation, solidarity, and the role of companies, and of course the role and responsibility of the states, so that we will guarantee the right to health. Before reading a little back story of the panelists that we have today, I would only like to share an idea that I think great as for how would this be, which is the essence of our debate today. The exchange of knowledge, intellectual property, and data will allow us to get a better advantage of our collective effort to boost the scientific discoveries and the development of technologies and a wider distribution of scientific knowledge and their applications on the basis of the right to health. We consider that under these essential points, we have to have an alternative model regarding the access to drugs and the international governance in every one of our countries, and generally speaking, also as for the world and humankind. And then I would like to give the floor to our first panelist, Dr. Germán Velázquez. Germán Velázquez, doctor, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And Dr. Germán Velázquez is a special consultant on health for the Geneva, Switzerland Center from 2010, executive consultant of the director of the center. His labor there is very important, and he's going to talk to us about this because he's a center that is working in researching and giving assistance, technical assistance and training in the spheres of health and access to drugs and the intellectual property. Particularly, Germán Velázquez graduated from the Javerian Bogota University with a philosophy master and humanity that was complemented with a economy master and economy of health in Paris. In 2010, he had an honoris causa doctorate in public health from Caldas University in Colombia. And in 2015, with the same condition, honoris causa doctorate from the Complutense University in Madrid. Up to May the 2010, he was director of the Public Health Innovation and Intellectual Property of the WHO and the General Director Office in Geneva in this area of health and intellectual property and drugs. Actually, he represented the WHO in the Council of the APIC on 21 up to 2010. He has a great number of articles in English, French, and Spanish, and he will talk to us particularly today on how we can rethink the innovation and development of drug products after the pandemic. Thank you very much. Good morning, Herman. Welcome to the CISS. You have the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Well, sorry, maybe it's afternoon to me, but to you it's actually good morning. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation, and most of it, rather than being thankful, to really congratulate you for this initiative because we're under a moment in which this kind of exercise is completely necessary. So this pandemic has make it evident that there are many things that are not working in the health sector. The presentation or talk I'm going to have to you and I'm going to share with you is a little paper that you'll be able to find in the web page from the South Center. It's a little paper that is like 15 page long. I wrote 2 weeks after the pandemic when we were locked down. I'm talking about the mid of April this year. And the mid-April, we realized that this researching system and development system that we have in the whole world for drug products is not really working. We really know it, but it could not satisfactorily answer to a situation that we are facing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Sorry, um, can you hear me well? Hello? Yeah, we can hear you. Okay, sorry. It's just that there was some words, some noise coming. So I was telling you that it was in the first stages of the pandemic that realized the research and development model had to be seen again, and it had made evident the situation and the problem that we were facing in the masks and medical appliances. But it could also be with the drugs that we expect to be arriving and the famous vaccine. So in the World Assembly of Health, which is the first world assembly in the history of WHO in 70 years, virtually speaking. So there are many interesting things that are linked to the topic of today. And the executive director of the South Center sent a message to the assembly, which was an exceptional assembly, where there were like 12 presidents or that were talking to the assembly. Nothing like that had ever happened. The maximum number was like a president of a prime minister, so that it would be 12 presidents or prime ministers from different countries in the world, including France, Germany, Spain, etc., that would address to the assembly. And in that time, many agency heads in the United Nations also talked. And I'm going to read an extract of the message by Professor Carlos Correa, who's the executive director. It's necessary to have world measures immediately coordinated by a WHO reinforced to guarantee that products for analysis, treatment, and prevention of COVID would be available for all the countries at the same time. All the dimensions or technical knowledges, including those related to medical appliances, would be able to be used by multiple producers to manufacture and distribute products with quality in the amounts that are needed. So this, something like this by Professor Correa was repeated by many statesmen, President Macron in France, National Director of United Nations Terrorists, and several state commanders. They were talking about the future treatments and drugs would have to be for the public dominion, because they were like instruments that were necessary for an emergency like this in the planet. So the crisis, as I said, showed us a huge failure in the system of research and development. So what I am going to suggest here is something which is not new. It's something that has been there for more than 10 years, which was like the possibility of adopting a linking instrument such as allowed by Article 19 by the Constitution of WHO as a way to finance the research and development, so that the result of that research would be for the rest of the people, for the whole world. So the 4 points that I'm going to talk to you about today are these the 4 ones that you see, and the conclusions of the model of these research and development. Some problems, some main problems. There are many, mainly those that are we seeing now. Some problems of the current model of research and development, and a little summary of the components of a linking part of these research and development, and some recent initiatives, and some conclusions. So I can tell you it's a little bit disappointing that, as I said, this paper was written in the second half of April, and unfortunately things are not going the best way possible. I'm finishing a new paper that is going to be issued in 8 days, which is the problem of world production of drugs and the local production, as well as the production by the states in the public sector. And I believe we're doing wrong, because if the vaccine without the vaccine, we are longing for that vaccine. If it were here today, it could create more problems than solutions, actually. So the pandemic we're going through is not something new. It's not something we didn't know about. It was not a surprise for the public sector and for entities like WHO. Look at this document from WHO in 2018, 2011. WHO says that, and we warn the countries about a continuous pandemic of flu, with economic and social potentially devastating uh, consequences, particularly for developing countries. That was in 2018, 2011. 10 years ago. It was after the H1N1 pandemic, and from there on, the WHO and its assembly and the General Assembly of UN has always told us that the only thing that we don't know, there's a date, but we know that there's an imminent risk of a global pandemic. Ever since 26, that is to say 15 years ago, we've been talking about this linking convention for development. So that was 2006, a report made by WHO, which is known as CIPHI in English, which was a commission of our information and intellectual property in health. And after that commission, that was chaired by the Vice President of Switzerland, Ruth Dreyfus, he made 60 recommendations that was about intellectual property. Obviously, due to the causes of industrialized countries where we have the pharmaceutical industry, those were not adopted, and we started an exercise called the GSPOA, which is the World Strategy of Intellectual Property and Public Health from WHO, which is the most important organization in the history of WHO. After 2 years of negotiation, the technical topics of the WHO take almost hours. This was like 2 years of negotiation, and with the participation of more than 170 countries. In the end, we have a document which is the World Strategy of Drugs, approved in 2008, and has a recommendation also on the need to urgently start negotiating a linking agreement in order to finance research and development. These didn't go forward. There were many objections from the United States, mainly Switzerland, and the European Union. They started having the extraction elements. They started talking about demonstration projects, so on and so forth. And they left in standby the possibility of negotiating an agreement. Thanks to a great group of developing countries, these developing countries asked again the WHO or General Director to create a special working group with international entities to see how we could actually apply all the recommendations regarding health and intellectual property, so that they created this group known as the CAWG, which was a work group that would suggest a general director. And this work group recommends clearly to start again the negotiations for in order to get to an agreement. From 2012 to 2016, the WHO abandons the idea of an agreement, and the PNUD, where we have our colleague that is going to talk after me, Judith. She's got a great initiative to convince the General Secretary to have a global consultation, and in the end of 2016, what they call the high level panel of the General Secretary of United Nations, chaired by Ruth Dreyfus, the co-director of this report. In that report, one of the recommendations for in order to solve the problem of access to drugs is to negotiate a world convention. And the resolution 6222 by in 22, there should start a negotiation intergovernmental, formal intergovernmental, to have an instrument that is linking in investigation and research and development for the innovation of health. We are, obeying a mandate by the organization, because up to now we have not done anything at all. So where does this come from? The possibility to have a linking agreement. WHO has an article, which is Article 19 of their constitution, that was adopted in 1948 when they created WHO, which says that the Health Assembly will have power to adopt conventions or agreements regarding any matter which is within the scope of the organization. It will be approved by two third parties of the assembly, and then the countries will have to take it to the national level, which is the parliament of the country in most of the countries, and then that will become a law. And the only time in the 70 years of life of the WHO, this article has been for the framework convention for the use of tobacco, and as you know, has become a law, and it's something that is accomplished in most of the countries. And I believe that many people in my generation would have never imagined that it was not going to be allowed to smoke in the public offices, restaurants, trains, bars, or planes, etc. And that is a public measurements. Those that know about public health know that tobacco is one of the first causes of mortality in the world. So that the WHO has a possibility to have linking regulations to legislate regarding health. So WHO is the world government of health, and they do not have a parliament, and they don't have the possibility to make laws. They have the article, but the article is not in use, so that a government cannot work without the capability of legislating and imposing the evidence, mainly when we're talking about public health. It is curious that the international community gave WHO, Commerce International Organization, gave a linking character of most of resolutions in regarding international commerce. They are a mandatory, which does not happen with public health, and mainly, which is pretty serious in moments like that when the ones we're living a pandemic. So this is why I was telling you at the beginning that the arrival of a vaccine today could be very serious, because we do not have a world uh, uh, regulator. We know that the vaccine, in order to be immune, we would have to vaccine the 60% of world population. That is to say, 5,000 million people. We do not have the capability of producing 5,000 million vaccines. So that means that we will have to create rules on how and who is going to vaccine according to the priority. There's no plan actually now. There are some recommendations only by WHO, and it will probably will be done nationally. That is to say, WHO is deciding that sanitary personnel should be the first one to vaccinate, then sanitary after them, the vulnerable population, which is older than 60 years, 65 years, and then the third ones, those that may have health problems that would become them ill if they have this illness. Now, internationally, we cannot do that. Internationally, what is going to happen is what is being said in the nationalism of vaccines and treatments, because we've seen several, attempts by President Trump trying to buy a German uh, factory, and they have bought the remdesivir reserves, and we're not sure about their efficiency yet. But since it's one of the only resources that we have, he said, I'm going to buy everything. So nationalism is here, and I think that is what is going to happen is that the country discovering the vaccine will have the temptation to vaccine first of all its population and then export of vaccines. So either China, India, or the United States, whose population is great, they're going to have serious problems in the war against this pandemic. So that was what I was talking to you about, the way it's going to be organized and the production. I was talking about that a little while ago, and production is having a very interesting phenomenon that risks that we're going to have a reorganization of world production of drugs. And you've read in the newspapers very concretely that many countries that we had like 10 or 15 years ago, they sent their production of raw materials and some finished drugs to Asia because they were cheap to produce there. And now they're scared because there's a drug uh, lack of drugs. Maybe those drugs may not come from the Asia. So one of the greatest factories of active products were in Wuhan in China, and there was a lot of time that they stopped producing. So they realized, American and European people, that there was a they were depending on the active principles from outside, and they have to repatriate that production. France has just gave Sanofi 300 euros to have a factory of active principles. So we're talking about a pharmaceutical sovereignty and uh, security of health and access to drugs. This is going to take us that the developing countries that are industrialized are going to try to do, because what we've seen that in the world was completely interdependent. Nobody, no country in the world, not even the most developed, was completely autonomous regarding the drug manufacturing. So they're going to try to do and get an autonomy in medicine that is going to lead us to the great installed capabilities in China and India of raw materials could be thought as, developing countries that have the capability will start to produce or formulate many of those that have now the possibility to have raw materials or active products by importing the raw materials and the active principles from India or China. So I believe this is going to be an opportunity to enhance or improve the access to drugs. And you have to place public health before commerce and profitability. So the second point.
Like the current development model I'll accelerate my pace a bit because I'm a bit delayed. Now, briefly, just to tell you that the current research model for development of medication is their public-private research, more private than public, which leads us to patents that has a 20-year period or term to comply with. That patent gives a monopolic legal monopoly. That's 99% of the cases. That means high prices. And high prices are translated into restriction of access. What I mean to say is that from the creation of the World Commerce Association, when they enforce the patent or intellectual property for international trade, the medication that are part of the market currently normally are now under a patent, and they have a patent of 20 years. That happens with the World Health Organization or the Commerce Agency. In the OMS, 15 years ago, we see that the private sector is participating in as part of the OMS at the Commerce Agency. And today I tell you this because today, speaking about public budget, public contributions of the member countries, of course, are part of the OMS. That's what's sent to the OMS. There's private donations, and there's different philanthropic agencies like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which at some point or today, I mean, once that the United States simply backtracked or decided not to participate with giving budget to the WHO, then we have the entities such as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, some of the indicators of failures in the model, there is a lack of transparency of the real cost of research and development. There was a very intense debate last year regarding this because we're talking about transparency and accountability that was approved by the WHO or OMS. I mean, the pharmaceutical innovation has declined in the last years. The prices are being blocked in medications. There's fragmentation and a lack of management, which is a very important problem nowadays in amidst a field of research and development. There's waste and there's a overprice or price the cost of development and research in the industry, and the industry has communicated this since the past 4 or 5 years. The development of a new molecule costs around $2.5 million. Currently or recently, the foundation that's called DNDi in Geneva, they launched medications that took 8 years to develop and the price of that stock was $55 million. You'll have to realize that when we know about the price of a medication that's $2.5 million and other entities are saying that they don't have that the cost of it is 55. I mean, we have to think about the problem of pricing, and we have to have facts or hard data to know how much does the creation of medication costs really. And the decline, and I take this as an example from France because France is one of the most important markets in the world and it has its characteristics which are very interesting. The medications are reimbursed collectively to the contributors. That's the state and that's the management of Social Security in France. In France, supposedly, we have any person that obtains medication anywhere in the world will have to or would try to patent it in France at some point. But in the Prescript magazine, that's an independent journal, one of the most important magazines in the world, they specify that since 2007, 2017, in a 10-year term, the deployment or use of new medications are 4.7 products per year. They also state in this journal that back in 2007, they launched 14 new products in the market, and in 2017, they only launched one product into the market. Now, the new prices of medications, I mean, in Sofosbuvir, Gilead, the pharma Gilead, they launched this product and the patient had to be treated for 12 years. It costs Well, $84,000. In 2015, our combi had Vertex with $133 US dollars. In 2018, there was a leukemia medication that cost $133 US dollars. And the last medication that's called the most expensive medication in the world. It's against muscular atrophy. It's from Novartis, Switzerland. It costs $2,100,000 US. And that's one dose of one shot that's been developed by Novartis. And these medications don't cost this much. These are the prices that are given. I mean, they cost to produce them. They cost like the tenth of what the cost is. 4 or 5 years ago, the industry changed its paradigm, and that time ago, we know now that the price of a medication, it's not like the cost only, as we've said since the past 60 years. It's manpower, raw materials with a return because of the benefit. But the cost, I mean, we don't care about how much it costs. That's not our core interest. Our interest is the value of medication. When we speak about the value of the medication, it's a whole different subjective concept. We can't just think that the price of a life costs this much. I mean, if you're going to save somebody's life, then use the $2,100,000 that so has my costs. But another thing is who can pay for such a medication at that price? So there's a lack of balance in the core structure in the system. If there's research and development, but that research and development is not something that people can buy or have access to, nor the health insurances in the country, they can't buy it, then we have a very serious problem to rethink. We have to think about how we're going to do things. There's been progress in the WHO. They have the blueprint that's a database, a DB. You can access that DB. There's a lot of information regarding COVID. And we've been told, for example, there's 139 vaccines for COVID right now under clinical trials and development. So there's 12 or 11 clinical trials. It's extremely important. It's a first step forward, but we have to share information. It's not enough. After that, we need to draft the rules of the game here, and that's what we're lacking. There's also a waste. Imagine we're amidst like planet chaos, tragedy. If these more than 100 vaccines, which are being developed in different IT platforms, if those were part of that same development technological platform, if they share that information, and we know who obtained what, if we lack data, we need to see who has more clinical trial data. Trading or sharing that information would give us results faster, and the costs of development would decline. Even amidst such a situation as a pandemic, the WHO, the OMS would do this if the economies or countries enabled it as an agency to have these binding provisions. There could be an arbitrage, but if the OMS could have the authority and the capacity to do something, a brief summary of what the elements of the binding convention could be. In this convention, first of all, we need to have a trust fund, a public fund for research, international research and development in pharma. We have to make it sustainable, and all the countries should contribute according to their economic development and social development. Nowadays, they do this, and the result or the products which are the result of this public trust fund or fund should be considered of public property, not under a patent. And all the countries that have the capacity to produce it could produce it and should not have to wait 20 years until the patent ends. This is constituted by three pillars. That's the core of the convention. Many of you experts know, many of you scholars know, this has been drafted recently in the past 10 years. We have public financing, that's a mechanism which is compulsory, and all countries have to be present. Okay, so so their ownership of that information, it's public, and we'd have to coordinate what's happening with research, and that right now we're not completely managing the things, and we're all in different countries trying to research about the same things in a parallel fashion. Now, Lastly, the third pillar is a pillar that seems absolutely well clear, but the agenda, the research agenda for development and production has to be defined according to the fundamental priorities of public health. I mean to say, we need to focus on research. People are dying and getting sick. And this is not being done today. There's research in which we research pharma, then there's a market to be capable of benefiting also the private entities. But briefly, there's a need to progress with certain speed to have some recent initiatives in Germany and Canada and Chile and Ecuador. I understand that they're working on this in Colombia and Argentina. These countries have been going through an adaptation process since March to guarantee the capacity to submit or issue licenses for medications, vaccines in other countries and diagnostic data and now technology for COVID-19. This is very important because there's a fund, there's a trust fund, there's an initiative that's been passed by Costa Rica. It's important for all these technologies which are related to be of public domain for the industry. Let's think about it. Let's not be naive. When somebody tells me about licensing and I would go back to Martin Luther King and quote him saying that history is a series of facts that prove that those who obtain a benefit have never given the benefit voluntarily. The initiative from Costa Rica, I hope it works out for the well-being. It would only be functional if there's countries that are clearly saying that they will make it compulsory for licensing for all these products to be, because we need this for the products. Maybe that will that will also trigger certain actions from the industry so they could voluntarily submit it, with the OMS. As a conclusion, we should include in amidst the pandemic situation, all the products, we should have all the products and technology related to the pandemic situation, which should be treated or commonwealth or benefit. I mean, Marta Decian told me 10 years ago, there was a suggestion that when a pandemic situation was declared, it should have been immediately communicated that the world is in a major health crisis. The information should be of public domain. Many heads of state said in the Global Assembly this year, they said that these products should be considered of public property or public commodities. The Assembly passed or approved during their session this year in the OMS. I mean, there was a veto from the USA. I mean, so it didn't last. The COVID-19 pandemic gives us the opportunity to rethink and trigger a new model to develop and research. We need, as I've said, a model that binds and links this structure in a structured way to have access. And based on the 19th constitutional article of the OMS, which enables us to draft treaties or conventions which are binding in its nature to begin and to finish. We should be brave enough to change the heading of things. COVID has shown us that there's serious problems that need resolutions, that need solutions, because this is one pandemic, but other pandemics could happen again if we need to thoroughly solve things to the bedrock in long term. We need to focus on the problems. This is a photograph of the three heads of intellectual property. Garrett to the left, the director of the OMS Theodos, and Roberto to the right. That's a session that dates back to 2018 in which they said that the patients come before the patents. So that's what we need to see amidst COVID. We need mindfulness or awareness at a global scale, and so we don't have patents that last 20 years. Thank you so much. Thank you, Doctor, for participating. Excellent. Your standpoint is excellent, giving us the context amidst the situation and alternatives. Alternatives, let's think differently. We have to thank Mr. Herman, Dr. Herman. Thanks for being with us. Thanks. There's a different time zone. You work in Switzerland, we've already known. He needs to leave us now, so he is going to end his session. We remind you that you have the opportunity to send your questions to the chat, to the blog, so we can send them. We can answer some of your questions right now. Some others can be sent to Dr. Herman. He's always welcomed and obtain our kind invite here in this conference on Social Security. And it's very important from the commission in the legal field. We're working because it's core interest for us to talk about the access to medications and intellectual property. There's a recent draft that was issued last year regarding mandatory licensing. And this year, we're working based on what's happening with COVID. We've analyzed and cross-referenced and compared data and see what's happening in some Latin American or America's countries when they there's some mentioned cases in Ecuador and Chile specifically. And before we continue, we repeat, we're so thankful, German, for having you accepted our invite. Thank you so much. I leave you without having a sense of guilt, let me say, because Judith now and Manuel, they know the subject more than I do, so they will be very capable of answering all the set of questions that you might have. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Thank you for the kind invite. Thank you so much. And we're going to start now with our second keynote speaker of the day. We're going to have our second keynote speaker's participation. In this case is Judith Rios San Juan. Ms. Judith Rios, let me share her bio briefly from her resume, from her professional development. First of all, Judith, we thank you for participating. We know about the quantity or the amount of interviews you're holding globally. Thank you, Judith, for listening to our call. Thank you. We're so thankful you're part of it. Ms. Judith Rios San Juan, she's part of the expert programs of Access and Innovation to Global Biomedical Research and Development. She's part of the United Nations Development Program, and she speaks to us from the epicenter from New York. Judith was responsible of the campaign of having access to medications in Médecins Sans Frontières. She has been a professor, scholar in different universities in the NYU in New York, Washington, D.C. University, and the Catalunya University in Barcelona. She studied law in Barcelona. She has a master's in international studies or grad studies in Geneva, and she's also obtained an accreditation from Stanford Law School in science, law, and technology. Judith will now give us room to answer one of the questions that popped up in our chat. Judith, why haven't we started working on this since 2011? I mean, the question starts from the following. Why haven't we had a debate of this theme since 2018? Has there been any progress? And precisely, we would like to know what has been the process like that has led us to this situation of pandemic situations. What's happening at an international scale? Judith, you'll be giving us information regarding this. Thank you, Judith, and welcome to our webinar. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to y'all. First of all, I thank and congratulate the Center of the Conference of the Inter-American Social Security for having invited me to be part of this event. Thank you for inviting me to be part of it. Thank you for allowing me to share some historical insights. It's an honor and my deep pleasure to be part of the panel. Such a bright panel, and so as a lawyer, I can tell you, as an attorney, briefly, I'll introduce you to my presentation, which will be centered on what the organizers asked me to do, compile the historic experience and situations that have existed during the search for cooperation and development of the Americas. The most of the information that I'll share with you today is objective data. It's hard data, which is readily available, and it's of domain. There's agreements that the member countries or economies have lobbied and proposed and agreed. I will express some of my opinions. My opinion is only my opinion. My opinion does not represent the entity or the United Nations, which is the body I work for currently. In my presentation, there's primarily three objectives. You're going to see that there's many points that are correlatable or that are similar. The organizers asked me to comply with meeting three objectives in my 20-minute presentation. They asked me to explain Why is cooperation and coordination and management of things so important? And what are the problems with that, where that cooperation and coordination does not exist? And we analyze the R&D or research and development biomedical situations. Lessons learned too. Lesson learned in the past 20 years of negotiations. We're researchers trying to find solutions. What have we learned? What have we done in the last 20 years to find solutions? And third point, I'm here to propose a possible, feasible, conceptual frame for everything that's happening that could be useful to work forward on COVID-19. What I what I'll say is based on what I've learned. The decisions that any government body, agency, any entity should consider when they're trying to go through a process of being and fostering coordination and for research and development is the following. Those are my three core objectives as part of my presentation. I hope to respect the time I have. Jorge, I thank you. If you could tell me if I'm surpassing the 20-minute threshold so I can accelerate my participation today. Let's begin with the first objective. In my presentation, you're going to see why it matters and why the following is relevant. Why is research and development so important for medications, health, diagnostic data, the cooperation and coordination amidst the effort? And what happens when that coordination and working together does not happen or take place? I have very simple graphs here, and I know that amongst you as participants of this webinar, there's a lot of knowledge based on this. This graph shows that research and investigation for a vaccine, medical technology for diagnostic data is long, it's complex, it's constituted by many steps. Conceptually speaking, there's the core concept until we reach the phase of innovation, until that innovation reaches the patients and doctors. There's many factors, many models of financing. Sometimes there's no coordination, and all of these processes might not be aligned. That's been documented, and we've seen that there's gaps or those lagoons or gaps that exist in the face of the process of innovation and access. These gaps exist and have existed. There's cases of great success as well. There was a great revolution in the biomedical field in the past 20 years. There's great innovation that we have obtained and countries have received and patients have had access to. There was a revolution. There's new chemical entities. There's new innovation in that field, which we have obtained in the medical field, but there's still gaps. And those gaps are known as market failures. And these are just market failures or market gaps in the literature, in scientific journals or documentation in our field. Some call it gaps or market mishaps or failures of public policy in the design and draft of benefiting financing and finding incentives for financing this. The previous doctor spoke about the access gaps that we have in pricing, access to the medication, the lack of registration of the products in some countries. The problems we face are a great number of problems. I'm going to focus just on the innovation gaps. Gaps in innovation. We need to learn from the lessons learned in previous efforts to improve the innovation processes in a subtype of disease known as the forgotten diseases or conditions that are not like tuberculosis, amongst other conditions. There's many conditions or diseases where there's a gap. There's a lack of innovation in the Americas. These graphs show back in 2006 or 2006. It's a bit historical data. It's a problem that we've understood for many years. This is a study that took place thanks to DNDA and Médecins Sans Frontières. And in 2006, back then, they specified that there was a gap in the innovation process in conditions that had been forgotten, like diseases like malaria or tuberculosis and global disease, as we know it in English. There's 20% or 12% on global disease burden for forgotten diseases like malaria, amongst others. The death rate caused by these diseases lead us to mention that little effort has taken us to a success when fostering the use of new medications. Only 1.3% of all the drugs that have been discovered throughout that term of 20 1985 to 2004, or the studies of 2006, only 1.3% are for forgotten diseases. Now, and the majority of these are not just medications. There's medications or drugs that have been modified that exist to fight other diseases, and only three or four in this period of disease. There's three for tuberculosis and for other types of diseases like malaria. And I will not speak now about the chemical properties. This is a fatal imbalance, a balance here. There's no balance between the health need and the development in the health field and the response capacity and under innovation. If we know the problems from the get-go, from year 2000, back in 2006, this was published and it posed the challenges in many reports. There's been a great deal of interventions, participations from the public and private sector to promote, the development of new research in these forgotten diseases. There's been subsidies, grants also, which are incentives that drive forward economically towards innovation. Incentives or funding, from government like the US, the National Children of Health, the Defense Department, or other government or private institutions that are working for the Latam region or the Americas. The governments have invested in research and development. Different bodies have been constituted, created in the public and private field. There's been joint efforts, joint tables of work where there's government and philanthropic activities happening to foster the development. And amidst this, we developed strategies to reduce the cost in innovation and reducing the risks in parallel of that innovation amidst innovation. There's been many propositions, and we've reached the phases of implementation and had the laws or the legislation that specify how to regulate what's exclusive. There's the FDA priority review voucher for the neglected and rare diseases, which is basically that exclusivity in regulation that leads the regulator to have that exclusivity in a forgotten or neglected rare disease drug. We had around $200 million. There's been many waived off taxes also for the public and private sector for those entities that have decided to invest their resources and effort in researching this neglected rare disease. Of course, there is the possibility to obtain patents and monopolies, and that lead us to the word exclusivity when selling, trading, and fixing prices of these medications. So there's a great variety of incentives, strategies to finance this. We've tried many. There's been some proposed for the rare neglected diseases. In the recent experiences in the past 5 years, we have really focused on accelerating the regulatory experience or process to facilitate the sanitary licenses of these products. There's been positive scenarios, negative cases as well, when trying to accelerate the regulatory or legislation process. This acceleration has suffered critics because we have to make sure and comply and guarantee that the products are efficient. The efficacy should be optimum for the population. There's been strategies proposed of open technology, and open research. We need to find ways to share knowledge to reduce the costs of development and create strategies under a frame where we foster an effective way of working that's open with broader knowledge. There's been a lot of varieties of participations, diverse in each country, in each entity. We've developed a great variety of strategies. The great deal of entities or bodies or agencies that are working on the product development partnerships with PPAs, public private associations, these entities have financed. There's many people who are very philanthropic, like Bill Melinda Gates and other entities that have worked for the neglected rare diseases. Many institutions have been created and constituted in the past 20 years to promote with public private funds and philanthropic activity to make the knowledge in these sectors grow towards innovation with vaccines that are innovations to obtain diagnostic data for some diseases. I'll give you this matrix of data in which I explain a bit of the main stakeholders involved with AIDS, HIV, malaria, a forgotten, neglected disease, amongst others. In this matrix, you can see, and subjectively speaking, how do we summarize 20 years of trying to promote active innovation, cooperation amongst ourselves, and coordination in the rare neglected disease field? There's been positive experiences. There's a lot of experiments. There's a lot of participations in innovation to for rare neglected diseases. There's new chemical entities that are now part of the market, part of the economies. But a great deal of innovation has led us to an incremental state. It has not yet been a revolution. I know that there's many labs or chemistry units. There's a G finder that helps you find documentation to read, where we can see how financing and budgeting for rare and neglected disease happened, and the products which have been launched along with the medical technology.
from those efforts. And it's a mixed message, mixed success. There's a great focus on financing the first stages of research and development, in the scientific concept, the first and second stages of scientific trails. And there are many financing gaps when the innovation and development is much more expensive than phase three, where we have testing and making sure technologies are safe and efficient for patients. Phase three is one of the main ones for development of technology, and there are many products that are abandoned or die at the beginning of the innovating process and do not find sustainable financing systems or models that may finance them and be completed and reach the patients. Priorities: where does financing goes to, which drugs and vaccines and technologies are researched, and neglected diseases are designed by a few donors and philanthropic in countries. There's a global missing or lack of coordination or lack of transparency where these resources are used and what are the results in those investments that create many inefficiencies in the process. There is generally many exceptions to what I'm going to say now. There is in general a little involvement of the countries that are developing where these diseases are relevant, and the communities and patients that should be the first beneficiaries of this innovation process generally. And in generally, the decisions of financing, decisions of issuing of clinical results are taken by the financiers that are based on countries with a high uh, uh, income, like in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina. There is financiers and innovators that are important in this field of neglected diseases. And the last assessment of the 20 years of experience of these neglected diseases, there's a great push and a great focus on increasing the resources for research and development and trying to attract from the private sector so that they will work along with the public sector and they would work with these challenges. But there are many diseases that have drugs for them, like tuberculosis, where there is an innovating process which is important in the last 40 years, where these drugs, new drugs for tuberculosis, are available for a big minority, of the population. There's a problem with prices, adaptability, and general access and adaptation to these um, technologies. So these problems of access have not been solved in the last 20 years regarding these neglected diseases. In 2012, the study that I talked about, the 2006, was performed again to see if this lack of balance was still there. And borderless doctors had this similar study for the coming 10 years from 20 to 2011 that public and private investment for neglected diseases that are more diagnoses and drugs, but there's still an important gap and something that out of these 850 total products that were passed from 2000 to 2011, very few were focused on neglected diseases, and there were new chemical entities, new incremental uh, from the health, public health point of view. I have given a 3-minute summary of 20 years on what we have learned trying to solve the gaps and the problems and the lack of biomedical innovation for neglected diseases and strategies used from grants, subsidies, and public and private entities of cooperation, incentives for innovation, and the process of search for cooperation has not been only dedicated to neglected diseases. To me, there are 5 great efforts that have been in place in the last 20 years while searching a better coordination and cooperation international in this research and development. There's these neglected diseases that I have already talked, and from 2010 there is a recognition of a gap and a need of a global coordination while searching research and development for vaccines for the pandemic influenza. Yeah. And there's a public policies that are important where we promote sharing scientific data and general information to accelerate the innovation process and accelerating also the benefits of this innovating process. And in 2014, it's a year where Ebola, Zika, and pandemic situation really are globally relevant, and there's a great variety of public policies and institutions that are created to promote research and development, specifically in vaccines for these pandemic or epidemic scope diseases. So this nowadays, the regulatory acceleration effort and the document that is on your right to the R&D blueprint of the WHO, which is a key document to know what happened in 2014, where we try to coordinate the regulatory processes and accelerating these processes. We have a framework based on these, not based on the global security concept, where we created strategies to coordinate some of these efforts of research and development for Ebola and Zika. And in 2016, these efforts continue parallelly. There are different stages where the gaps in research and development are recognized and discussed by the global um, people. So this is EMR, antimicrobial resistance. So this is accelerated and elevated by to create the political moments of public policies. A high-level meeting in the UN in New York, where all the member countries agree a global decision, where an innovation is promoted, and we want to create a process of innovation and cooperation process in an antimicrobial resistance, and we decide for the development and research for new antibiotics has to be a global responsibility. E20 decided also to have a subgroup strategy where we share sub-regional and subgroupal coordination efforts. And one of the great innovators conceptually is they acknowledge that the innovation processes and innovation gaps are not only a priority for the developing countries, but also the lack of innovation in antibiotics is a global thing that affects all the countries, not only the poor countries. And so we need global strategies, and it is not enough having an increase in the public financing for the research of development, but we need to promote and experiment also with new models of innovation and incentive to that innovation that would grant that the antibiotics resulting from this process of financing are used properly, and that they would be accessible to the population. So those are conceptual proposals are developed, and there's a lot of literature about this in 2016 and 17. And in 2020, we're in the COVID year, in the COVID moment, where the point that I want to make now, mainly in this slide and the presentation in general, is that there are many options, there are many gaps for innovation and development that COVID is making clear. The lack of treatments and diagnosis with COVID are not isolated. There are many instrumentalizations of solutions that have worked, some of them, and no, some others not. And there's a lot of knowledge in the world of public health and in the world of public policies that may help the countries and other institutions to design a coordination and cooperation strategy for COVID-19 that would be more effective. The organizers also asked me to give a brief, as a second objective of my presentation, a brief summary of global negotiations in the search of this coordination. And I think lots of this information has already been covered by Professor Velasquez. I think this is a picture that shows you the summary and the long story, an excellent story of negotiations at a multilateral level that we have had in the search for solutions and coordination strategies and cooperation. Global negotiations for the access of drugs are very well known. Many people know about the negotiations, mainly the World Trade Organization, our flexibilities and strategies to promote access. We start a little bit later in the 90s, in 2003 and in 2006. There's a parallel negotiations that is pretty related and focused on the gaps of research and development. And this is not well known in many fields, even though to me it's very important and has had an important participation in the Latin American region. So the great proposals, legal and the public policies have come from very different countries, like in the region, like Brazil, Argentina, and Latin American countries like Barbados, Bolivia. And I'm forgetting about some proposals that have been made by countries in these negotiations and that have been incorporated in the resolutions that have been approved in the last years. There are two moments that are fundamental in this negotiation that, in my opinion, started in 2003 and 2004. One is Resolution 6121 in 2008, where the global strategy is approved, which is a document that was agreed by all the member countries after 2 years of negotiation, and it really reinforces the mandate of the WHO regarding topics of access and innovation, also of drugs. This is a very important resolution that I really recommend you to read, but because there is an agreement on which are the roles and responsibilities and how the WHO and countries is how these topics to be agreed and promoted. And in 2012, we have the second great moment when they're issued, they publish the report known as CWG, which is the report on the groups of independent experts of research and development to coordinate and promote the coordination and financing strategy globally for research and development. This report, as Germán Velázquez said, had a very specific mandate that was to examine proposals and propose solutions for the problems and gaps of research and development of type 1, 2, and 3 diseases, mainly 2 and 3 diseases that are neglected diseases that increase proportionally in developing countries. How to promote more innovation for these neglected diseases. And the recommendation on the report are clear. One of those mentioned by Dr. Velasquez is that member countries should start negotiating a linking agreement in order to coordinate efforts better and financing that is made in research and development. But there are some other recommendations in this report in 2012 that are also important. Other recommendations are that all governments should finance research and development. There's a lack of balance in the level of public financing. Some governments are financing innovating processes and are dedicated public resources for the biomedic process, but there are many governments that are not responding at a level that we would like in the sense of prioritization of biomedic innovation. We recommend that member countries be involved and they would be allowed to be involved in the process of priorities so that priorities and the decision of priorities may be shared among all the countries, especially the developing countries where there are where these diseases and drugs are more needed, and of course that we have a greater involvement of patients and affected communities. And a third party that I wanted to talk about this report, there's a series of recommendations that are important about the reformation of the incentives to innovation. So they really recommend that creators of incentives on innovation, maybe governments or philanthropic financiers in the private sector, may explore incentives to innovations that may separate or devinculate the cost of products from the cost of innovation, with the promotion of innovation models that are open to warranty innovation and access to these at the same time. There's a great variety of recommendations. There's a very extensive report. It is available in all the languages, including Spanish, and I have the webpage of the report. And even though it was published in 2012, it's very relevant now for COVID and many other illnesses or diseases. What has been the follow-up to those recommendations and report? Well, it all depends on how we see this, if it is half full or half empty. There's not enough follow-up. We may say that there's always the capability to have a deeper follow-up to these recommendations. So of course, there are still a lot of gaps and challenges in public health that are being neglected. But there have been, follow-ups and the implementation of some of the recommendations. They have created in the World Health Organization, we have a global observatory about research and development where they try to increase the process of transparency of the investments of our research and development. We have created uh, standardization processes or prioritization strategies for development and research. We have created globally some regulations about research and development. I want to stress the language that was included in the declaration about microbial resistance, the political declaration in 2017, where they say that basically the main principles that were recommended for research and development were global norms for the development and research of antibiotics, and there are some other proposals that are being studied, and of course, and not giving an answer to the need and the public needs of what we would like. Dr. Velasquez has already talked about the research of high level, which is a General Secretary report, a group of independent experts asked the PNUD and the ONU-SIDA, which were the two organizations that coordinated the group of these independent experts. The report was published in 2016 and it is also available in all languages. And I also recommend you to review the recommendations from the experts of a high level where they promote different strategies to boost cooperation and coordination. One of the key strategies is the promotion of transparency, which is one of the strategies that we've been more active in. As Dr. Velasquez said, in 2017, the WHO had the resolution 72.8, where all the member countries of this WHO would agree to have measurements of promotion of innovation. I think I took too long. I'm going to stop over here, and we're going to take a look at the conclusions. And I think it would be better if we talked about the panelists in an open way. So I'm going to stop over here. And I'm going to thank you for the invitation again and wishing to participate in the discussion. Thank you very much, Judith, for your excellent participation and excellent talk. What we've seen up to now, their conceptions and how the pharmaceutical industry, how the process of medicines is very complex. It has several points. It's not an easy point. We've been working with that where there are experiences with like we said at the beginning of this webinar, is what we call is a revealed truths on the access to medicine. And there's some experience, some value gaps regarding the production of pharmaceutical industry and the access of people with less resources. So normally we have a conception that comes from countries that are in development or developed countries, such as a developed pharmaceutical industry with technological development and the countries and policies that we assume and we even have developed. And last, our last panelist, Dr. Becerra, is going to give us one more vision, not different, but a little from a different point of view about this point. I will read his bio, which is a very extensive uh, resume. I will give some references only. Dr. Manuel Becerra Ramirez is a law doctor, is international law doctorate from the ex-USSR. He's a national researcher from the National System of Researchers, and he's also a titular researcher, a full-time by the Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas from UNAM, and the National University of Mexico acknowledges him as the first level. He's an international public law in the faculty of UNAM. He's a coordinator of international right, and he's director of the yearly book of international right in Mexico. He has been a researcher in different universities in California, Atlanta, Los Angeles, La Habana, Ottawa, and Oxford in England. He's also a member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences. Welcome, Dr. Becerra, and of course, we thank you for your contribution and your point of view on what is all that is about the role of the international organizations in the scope of Covet. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank organizers and specifically Dr. Jorge Orbelin and Dr. Laura Vidal, and of course, the director of CISS, Gibran Ramirez, for the invitation to participate in this so important event, where it is a pleasure to listen to my previous colleagues. And actually, there's not a lot to say. I'm going to simply take as a reference point what was mentioned before, so to make an emphasis on my conclusion. And mainly what I'm going to talk about in these 20 minutes, which actually, Jorge, if you may tell me beforehand, before I finish, so that I will not take too long. What I am going to say now is in the beginning, the importance of the moment that we live in now. It's a pandemic, a universal pandemic, and definitely this would produce in a normal moment the participation of the international organization, so that we will see that generally how the organization, international organization, institutionally as well as governments and government entities and associations have reacted that are not institutionalized. And finally, center our attention in the great problem that we have in human health in the COVID-19 era. And finally, my proposals that are not going to be pretty different, but on the other hand, I'm going to emphasize on what they have mentioned before. So first of all, would you change? Oh, okay. So the first idea is the reference point, my starting point. The General Secretary of United Nations, as you see in this slide that you see, has expressed something that I believe is something. It's like the centralization of the moment we're going through. In the beginning, Antonio Gutierrez, who is the Secretary of the United Nations, we are facing a world health crisis different from the ones presented in 70 years of existence of the United Nations, is affecting the human suffering and affecting the life of people and nations. So there's sentiment in the international politics that COVID-19 has affected radically and directly different aspects of the international community, not only regarding health, which we all can say something, but also in the economy. The economy can also be the part of energies and the security, not only in health, but also generally speaking. Now, before this situation, what has been the reaction of the international community? The system of United Nations, in the next chart, the UN, which is a product of First and Second World War in last century, is a system that is made up by a backbone, which is international law, right, but also a system of international organizations where in the center, like a solar system kind of organization, we have UNO. This UNO, which is linked to other international organizations through international agreements. The UNO has very wide capabilities that really is done through vinculation that there is with the WHO. So, in this solar system, the core point is dedicated to security in the world. The world system security, which is pretty worn out, let's say, which was one of the causes of the causes for the First and Second World War, is centered in an organization in the UNO, in the Council of Security Council, which occupies a very important place in the UNO because it's the only organ that has coercive empowerment. According to the seventh chapter of the San Francisco letter, the Council of Security is the only one that has teeth. That is to say that they may dictate a linking decisions and may force the parts to comply with their resolutions. This is the core part. Now we have to also say in this that regarding international security from the creation of United Nations in 1945 is focused on a concept of triggering of conflicts, war conflicts. And there's a certain reason for this. But actually, after the Cold War and the fall of the United USSR and the bipolar system, as the academia and the politicians try to focus the international security system to other aspects that were not really of a war character. We've talked about in the academy about a system which is a preventive one, where we have to tackle questions of poverty, internationally speaking, violation of human rights, and of course, as we're going to see in matters of health. So there's a very interesting discussion in the doctrine and in some manifestation of states for changing the focus of international security. And this is logic. In the practice, in the last practice, we've realized that, as it was said by the previous speakers, there have been problems of health in a pandemic character, such as AIDS in 2000 and Ebola in 2014, where the Security Council, there's a starting preoccupation for this phenomenon of health. And it has reached levels to considering that these health problems may consist or constitute a problem that may endanger the international peace and security, which is the core objective of the Security Council. Nevertheless, there's a resolutions in the middle of year 2000 and 2014, and later on in 2017, they are pretty, let's say, pretty weak. That is to say, that only by using the language of diplomacy, then they all give the international community a situation where they have to use resources or they should preoccupied by health problems without centering in them concretely. So let's take a look at the second table. I have to say this because the Security Council of the United Nations.
It's not new. It's not new. There's certain problems because of the times we live in. I will say that in 2013, the National Security Council of the United Nations dictated a series of resolutions or submitted sentences, and it constituted a committee. And that committee was fighting to counteract terrorism, and that committee has its fundamentals. The Article 39 of the San Francisco Charter specifies that it has broad scopes, or that Security Council has the broad capacity to do what it needs to do. The Security Council, and we've seen as advisors, it's like the international global legislative branch. It's not an international law class today, but precisely between these committees that submit resolutions or the sentences of the committee, there's a series of resolutions that are part of the analysis of internal law or legislature of different states or entities. There's financial institutions being analyzed systematically, and the revenue services of different economies are also part of it, which reach the individuals. I highlight this because this is what's happened in the case of the problem that we face with the pandemic. It is true that during this year, amidst the pandemic with COVID-19, there's been some have been promoting a series of data that you see, Franco Tunecina's proposal or that instrument of Franco Tunecina led us to debate the possibilities of being capable of having certain war conflicts in the world as a consequence of COVID-19. However, that is something that what I'm going to say is something that I must say. These sentences or resolutions have been negotiated under another frame. There's international compliance that's political. There's this warfaring situation between US and China. That's another way in which we can see this being manifested in this new world order, because there's that the socialist bloc taking action. Remember that in the United Nations Security Council, it makes it feasible to veto permanently five consiglieri from that commission. So anything that's proposed from Russia or China is vetoed by or it's banned by the USA because of the stand of Mr. Trump in the case of the pandemic and their relations with China. This French Tunisia proposal that has been difficult to accept because it's been generating some sort of grievances or situations between the U.S. and others. In the next chart, if you could change the slide, please. In the next table, you'll see that there's also been a reaction. There's a reaction, counter reaction from the General Secretary of the United Nations. Precisely this year, during March 25th, the General Secretary of the UN submitted the global plan to fight the plan that is global to fight COVID-19. It is interesting to make it so focal, and we've seen this before. To speak solidly about what the general or the lead of the United Nations specifies that the great problem is to have money in this case for the global plan, which also uh, is a plan that's going to be using $2,000 million to fight COVID-19. This seems very interesting as part of the global plan. We see what's the skewed or the response of the global entity or the United Nations. Next chart, please. Now, in this plan, this global plan, as you can see, it's a matter of analyzing the quantity that we've mentioned, $2 billion. That money is going to be used to send equipment, launch communication campaigns, specifies aerial strategies, and in that plan, in the draft, it's not just an individual response plan. It's a joint universal global plan. That's the essence, in virtue or understanding that the pandemic is also threatening all the globe, all humanity. So we should jointly work together. It's not enough to have an individual response, and there should be a collective response, and that's a good heading. It's a positive heading, and that's the heading that the United Nations has decided to walk down according to the General Secretariat of it. Now, there is also the General Assembly of the United Nations, as you well know, is the body in which all the member states of the entity converge, they submit resolutions also. In our country, there were proposals. Our country submitted its proposal, and the resolution about the proposal or instrument is very important. It's a breaking point, or it's a kickoff point as an instrument that leads us to give a response of this global plan. Precisely in that instrument, we speak about culture and the vaccination culture. Somehow we have to guarantee a fair access to the vaccine that highlights the important role that the WHO plays amidst this as a stakeholder. It's very important. You know it, I know it, because of the news that we obtain from the world. There is right now a standoff, a total face-to-face standoff between the US and the World Health Organization, or WHO. And as we well know, it makes the U.S. withdraw its funds. Here, amidst the resolution, it stresses on the relevance, the importance the WHO's role is amidst it. It also, in the draft, it specifies that we have to strengthen cooperation amidst those who are of exact science, and we need to strengthen the cooperation of international scientists working together, including the private field. As you will see, and we can understand, we must highlight it because it has a solid message. And we're going to see later on that we're going to see who are the key factors or stakeholders who are part of research or investigation. So, furthermore, I could tell you about the role of another stakeholder, which is WHO, which is an expert body, as you well know. And I must highlight the following after what we've heard. It seems to be just a very important description of everything that's taken place in this area. Matter of fact, in health, this is what we call those orphan or neglected medications or drugs. We've analyzed the pandemic situations in Africa. Not only that, the research has to be also understood in we need to see what's international or industrial property in the field of health. And later on, we're going to be thoroughly analyzing this. We're going to try to find ways to understand international property and to have propositions or instruments that lead us to the creation uh, of, of draft instruments that are flexible, that lead us to flexibility. So here, I must highlight that the WHO, as it's been said by Professor Germán Velázquez, WHO has the capacity to submit, to issue its resolutions. And I highlight this and I stress on this point, but with the United Nations, its General Secretary, its head, they submit or issue its resolutions. And their resolutions are just as an advice. They're not binding, it's not compulsory, but we insist the system of the United Nations is the only body at this time being that could submit or issue the resolutions as advice. But the resolutions undoubtedly is very important. But we must see, okay, it's not enforceable, it's not binding, it's not, but we have to understand that the resolutions that you know, mark a line internally, and state entities or economies, they can decide, the economies can decide to adopt the recommendations and be also legitimate and do and comply with what it needs to comply. What that's another way to create and draft international law. When there's resolutions submitted by the WHO or other health entities, and without doubt, as it's been said by Mr. Germán Vela, it's also this body issues its resolutions, and they are legally binding because they have their bylaws, their mandates that date back to 2016, and there's international treaties, and it's mandatory for the economies who are part of it. So the resolutions that are correlatable to those laws and regulations are binding. Next. We have to also consider another element of what's happening with the WHO. The budget of this entity, I mean, it's a budget that we've heard about through Mr. Velasquez. Professor Velasquez mentioned it, and it's very important because it's from the States. There's many bodies or foundations that are part of it. It's 4.2 billion dollars, and we're talking about 300, 400 million dollars. The United Nations decided to pull back its budget from this body, and it's important for us to mention that the contributions to this type of body depend on the economic dimension of the different member states, we mean, the member economies. It's not, I mean, the economic conditions of the US or European countries are different in comparison to other smaller economies, but they all contribute. And there's another very important point there to mention. In international bodies, the states or the economies that are part of it contribute, but they have a lot of return or benefits, or there's fees for public officers that are part of that of body depend on the level of contribution from their member states. Thanks to the contributions of the United States, the withdrawal of the budget of the U.S. is also impacting the bureaucracy of the WHO. Please continue. Okay, well, within the international landscape, it seems to me, this is very complex. I'm not just going to stop with the complexities, but what I'm going to mention leads me to mention the impacts, the economic impacts. We'd have to review the proper response from the Monetary Fund or the World Bank and the WMF and so on. And there's been different economic problems of bankruptcy, even of some economies. The response from the World Monetary Fund, the response to this was to lengthen the negotiation of the external debts that countries are part of, but never did they, in any way or manner, think about the lack of payment or the default of having to negotiate all the billions in debt. And it's not, I mean, the response was, let's lengthen the renegotiation of the debt. But what's happening in Latin America, if we go through a review of the letter of the American states, it has a great deal of firepower, as to say. The Organization of American States can make front to a pandemic situation of this sort. And fortunately or unfortunately, it's very important for us to understand that the American states have given a response which is weak. Solely did the American states approve a draft of guidelines to face the COVID-19 pandemic under the principles of democracy, but they haven't specified or discussed upon what the core that's important for us. What's next? What is going to happen next in the healthcare sector? I mean, with everything they have in their firepower, and as we've said, the American states have the capacity to research, develop policies for pharma, and it's a shame. But this leads me now to speak of the obstacles when we speak of access, universal access of drugs against COVID-19. Now, I'm going to stop and go back to some of the points that have been previously mentioned. And by falling back to express my opinion, to construct my proposal. Now, undoubtedly, let's talk about the first problem, obstacles. What hinders? Now, what's already been said, it's the concentration of the pharmaceutical industry. Its focus, it's concentrated in only a few state entities and global companies. Now, the concentration of these entities or companies from pharma are precisely, they're located in the developed economies like the USA, Europe, China, India, and Australia, and Japan, and Latin America. In Latin America, you see the percentages, it's a minor percentage, it's 5.3%. Let's also mention that precisely this is one of the greatest problems. Professor Velasquez said that right now we have an opportunity for the states, for the economies to develop post pandemic. That's one of the landscapes, that's one of the rooms, that's one of the leeways that are being opened to the industry to develop, but that depends on many other issues. One of the obstacles that I will discuss later on also, which I've already mentioned and which was mentioned also by Ms. Judith Rios and Professor Velasquez. Now we're going to see here which are this instrument concentrates the conditions here. Somehow you see how it's clear. There's just a few international companies. It's an international monopoly of 10 companies globally in the world which hold the capacity to invest in pharma. Now, the trend is, you can see the trend by simply seeing the Monsanto and Bayer negotiations to create a unique monopoly. The trend is monopolic activity here. They want to monopolize the research and development and the trade of what's happening in pharma. This is extremely important because I'll go back to the next point, to one of the other obstacles. It's extremely important because we just stop to think and question why? Why is this monopoly standing at a global scale? Because this is what's led these global companies or international companies to have domain over the pharmaceutical market globally. And the importance of all of this leads me to say, and I manifest the following just with a simple number. In Mexico, The pharmaceutical market shares is approximately of $14 billion. And and that makes total sense for so now I can tell you that what the companies want to achieve is simply business. Maybe not much. Maybe they don't care much about the health of the population. One of the problems that I've already mentioned is the system of intellectual property or industrial property. So we can understand the great problem that underlies, and this has to do with international economics based on what happened back in the 80s. Back in the 80s, a whole movement started, and we can think about a movement of national, international, global economic policies. And these economic policies, if you'd like to tag it, is neoliberalism. The neoliberalism movement gave room to another response after having American, Japanese, and Swedish companies lobby certain things. So back then in the 80s, intellectual property and international trade, these matters were discussed before the great international treaties, or trade agreements, which Velasquez mentioned before the Arctic or the GATT or the 110th article. The pharma industry was not under the intellectual property laws. One of the great uh, crucial moments is the introduction of the element of intellectual property because it's the knowledge of international commerce law code. Now, and there's an amendment, substantial adjustments of this international law, and that's what's happening now. And I insist. This is part of the literature. There's a lot of documentation about the subject, and we can prove that after the companies, these global companies, were lobbying, they are the ones that made intellectual property in the pharma chapter important. So, intellectual property in pharma is part of that movement that took place then, that has not stopped now. After ADPIC, in ADPIC, quote unquote, there's a setback in the pharmaceutical field after the discussion or dialogue of what happened with the AIDS situation in Africa or anthrax in the USA. I mean, there's a setback, but in 2003, there's an initiative from WHO, and in that project, we have the Doha Agreement, and with the Doha Agreement and WHO, it allows us to simplify systematically the laws and regulations in the field of intellectual property by creating a possibility of making licensing mandatory. And there's a different way to interpret provisions which are stringent on intellectual property. Along with that movement, in parallel, there's another movement that took place to strengthen intellectual property laws in commerce and in literature. This has been named the TRIC Plus or the ADPIC Plus. These are international treaties which are negotiated not at international level but bilateral levels because it's not the same to negotiate, to have developed economies negotiate, to another negotiate, or other entities from the pharma industry at a global scale, you know, and or negotiate between a powerful state and a small economy, uh, or a middle-sized economy, as Costa Rica or even Mexico. So there's these type of treaties where the systems to protect intellectual property are stringent, specifically in pharma. And in pharma, we call them treaties, which are the ADPIC Plus treaties. Mexico has adopted these treaties, a part of this movement, the TTP 11 and now TEMEC. But that is another another story that we have adopted. We have adopted these international treaties where the pharmaceutical patents are stronger by broadening the terms of growth, by limiting also the mandatory licensing, which is also a movement which would go against the logic that health should be part of at a global scale. Next slide, please. I have to talk about another phenomenon that is part of international uh, relations that exist in the International Organization in 1945 when the United Nations was constituted. These special bodies start to simply start, they start to grow and prosper, or and after the decade of the 60s, 70s, where there's that the universal principles of international scope with the autonomy of African and Asian countries, there's a very interesting phenomenon that takes place. The developed economy, specifically the United States, this is the first time the United States of America has decided to withdraw from the WHO in an open negotiation with different economies, with a body that's so multilateral. It grew back in the 70s. We saw what happened back in the 70s. There were different international bodies that were working on the fields of science and culture in the 70s. But what's really interesting is that the international negotiation right now doesn't host the multilateral forums. And there's different bodies that have a different essence. We mentioned the initiatives of the G7 when we have the summits of strong economies, or G20, where there's countries or economies with great industry and emerging or developing economies as Mexico and Argentina and others. These are in these sessions they design financial issues, and then they replicate that in other financial institutions like the World Monetary Fund, etc., etc. What happened after the G20? It's clear after what's been said before that there's been some parties worry about the meaning or impact of COVID-19, and some stakeholders have said that there's a need to share through international negotiations. We need to negotiate positions and understand political positions and wills, and it's going to be very interesting. France, with Merkel and Macron, have been discussing their interesting positions. They've been hosting dialogues about the vaccine, and it's going to be the judged thing, the public judged thing. And at the end, there's socio-economic political negotiations that are not binding, which are not of the corpus of international law. They just express their international policies, maybe to have, well, more members at an internal level, but those ideas are not written in an instrument to legislate. I want to stop a bit now after what Professor Velasquez said, after what Ms. Rio said. There's a proposal from the WHO that seems excellent to me, and I'd like to analyze the treaty, which dates back to 2018. It's a very interesting proposition, but the great problem with this international treaty is that there's problems that also arise when there's other instruments or legislative instruments like the Paris Convention regarding climate change, where the developed economies didn't sign. They can negotiate it as the US did. At the end, those strong economies didn't sign it. And they're just mere, well, conventions or proposals that don't make it mandatory for states to comply, but it doesn't happen at a global scale. Of course, it's a great step forward. It can happen. It's happened because it makes it compulsory for different states. And then you can have international or legal case law of daily enforcement. And we have to analyze those international treaties and put ourselves back on that table to work for the institutions. There's movements, as I've told you, international legislative processes, and we can have those models, or we have those models to legislate internally. But I wouldn't be very optimistic before the stance of the positions of the economies. For example, the position of the US before the situation right now, there's a new there's a mind shift in geopolitical situations now. There's powerful economies that are trying now to become or to be the dominant party. And from the economic perspective, China is dominant. It's Russia, the European Union, the US, the Russia wants to have a different position geopolitically speaking. At an international scale, along all of this, we have all of these proposals, and for them to be enforced internationally, they should be accepted by all the economies involved. And what would be my last stance? My position here amidst this, in principle, it's something that I haven't argued about much, but I've had the point is the access to health of humans is very important because it's universal and it does transcend. It's part of a very important element of the previous movement of patenting pharma. We have to consider the laws and regulations and human rights. There's a great opposition. It's a frontal opposition, what we're facing. My point is, when redesigning these international bodies, an international body should be the manager, administrator of these situations. If there's pension, I mean, this is something that we've mentioned before in other presentations. The WHO, the trade
It's an
body,
international organization with a constitution and normativity, which is mandatory, legally speaking. I believe it needs to have higher powers. There's an international organization already that has been already explored, and the participation system of different states. I think that we have to take it as a point of reference in everything that is about pharmaceutical products. I think that everything that has to do with the pharmaceutical industry does not have to be part of intellectual property. I believe that intellectual property, under the concept of 1994, it has to do with international trade, health, and many other aspects do not have anything to do with international trade. And this is why the great problem is what APIC did, which was to give, get a lock in the development of intellectual property. So if you realize everything is vicious circles of discussion, what do we do, which is for true, that in order to invest or for new pharmaceuticals, for their investigation or research, we need multimillionaire resources. So, what the answer from the current model is that we have to give. But I guess this discussion is a little bit vicious because we cannot help with this when transnational companies have not seen what their level is of investment. Many times a pharmaceutical entrepreneur or a drug, we cannot have access to it. It's not due to their character of how much money they invested in the research, but because of brands and commercialization. So I believe that while we do not get pharmaceuticals from the regulations of intellectual property, we'll be going around without solving the problem. Vaccines and drugs, in that sense, should be concerned as a public thing. That is to say, it's something that does the system of human rights. So you gotta take a look at this very carefully. Health is part of human rights, and it's a mandate and obligation the state has in order to guarantee their population the right of health. So the way it can be done through a very much more fluid access. It worries that before a pandemic like the COVID, the OEA at this level of Latin America, we need to work on proposals. I think this international pandemic issue, as said by our friend Germán Velázquez, can also be a good chance for regional proposals. And we have not heard anything. So, apart from the proposal from Costa Rica, that is in the framework of intellectual property, flexibilities and make states to accept a greater availability of drugs through mandatory licenses. So, but we'll go to the same discussion. We have to consider that this pandemic, if we expect it, and we hope it will be soon, so I will be able to go to the barber shop. I will go to we have to be ready because there will be another pandemic later on. So with very concrete health policies, with access to medication according to human rights. I hope I have been right on time. Thank you very much. So thank you very much, doctor, for your presentation, as you usually do. In this case, a different vision on what it is and the way we should interfere internationally and the core importance that we have in international cooperation and how close we are to that and what are the main obstacles that we face because as you said, it is logical that there are very many interests, so we have to coordinate them and it's a challenge. We have a Q&A space now. Now, if you have any questions, maybe we will be able to answer them. We have a very first question that I would like Judith to answer, which is panelists ask, how can you make sure that COVID-19 vaccines will reach all the countries? I think that's the question that we all ask ourselves. I think in order to take advantage, how would you consider what it takes to consider the vaccine against COVID will be a global public good? That's an excellent question. And of course, it's the 1 million question. The definition, as it has been said, there political declaration by the United Nations Secretary General and many statesmen around the world indicating that any vaccine developed for COVID should be a global public good. The definition of global public good is discussed, and the way it is going to be implemented is going to be discussed. There's no recipe, there's no agreement, but there's some discussions globally on how we are going to guarantee this global access. First thing is to guarantee there is a vaccine. Make sure that there is a vaccine. It's not going to be only one, but it's going to be several. There are like 23 vaccines under research and development process, according to the data from the WHO. 23 vaccines that are considerably feasible for COVID in development, and there are 4 more that are in the highest or more advanced research and development phases. But we are still going to take some months in order to know there is going to be a feasible vaccine that would be safe efficient. And what we've learned in the last 20 years is warranting the access to these vaccines cannot be planned in the end of the process. We have to design strategies already so that everyone will have access in the process of financing of this vaccine. There should be strategies and conditions to warranty that vaccine to be accessible to a population. There are proposals that have been made by WHO and a legal framework of access to that vaccine, which is in the WHO webpage. It's a draft, a first draft of a framework of proposals of distribution of the vaccine, where criteria of distribution are seen within the population. Which population is a priority, medical workers, etc. These equitative principles have been considered by the member countries to be commented. But there are some other initiatives that can also be promoted, including initiatives of promotion of technological transparency and local production, so that will be a warranty that there will new barriers to the distribution to this vaccine, and the price will be accessible to population and the systems of health. There are many decisions that are still to be taken. So it's a question which is complex, and the solution is also complex. I think there are elements in this decision that are being assessed and discussed, but I also believe that there are elements that are still not under discussion and that should be introduced in the international arena and debates. Correct. There are some essential ideas we've already mentioned in this webinar. It's a very complex topic. It's a topic that is not coming from now, with capabilities of production of every country, and even the possibility of distribution, and considering also the fact of having innovation in this regard does not mean that there is access. What we have to try is that there should be a direct relationship between innovation and access, but an access to everyone in an equitative way, without distinction of social status or economical status or whatever. That's the way to go. But in order to get to that level or standards, we need to think equally in the innovation from the very process of incentives and how we can eliminate those in order to eliminate the later barriers for distribution. It's not a question actually, but it's just a comment. But we're going to add it up. It's one more that I would like to be answered by Dr. Becerra. In Mexico, public policies on health are very few, and they're not as interested as they should be. WHO should surveil that the governments and governed people should be reviewed. And considering these comment should not be completely true or not true, but it's a position. How could we develop, or how would be able to consider this with the current policy or new law of industrial property and the TMEC framework and the position by Mexico internationally in the promotion to access to promotion of access to drugs? Well, can you hear me? Yeah. Well, I believe that it is a very interesting comment that leads us to the need to think of a state policy regarding innovation development and in the pharmaceutical industry indeed. So we have very little space for movement. That is to say that we know that they've adopted a law of encouragement of technological development. And that's terrible because it goes beyond international treatments, concretely NAFTA. Why? Because it allows the patenting of a secondary use, or allows the extension of patents, which are characteristics of an agreement that we call APIC Plus, even though there is no obligation on the part of the Mexican state, which is pretty serious. the spaces of development with an integral character of a policy regarding health, they are limited in that sense. That is to say that there are 2 points of view. From the point of view of fomenting research and development in drug development and the access to drugs. There's this double vision and with very few space. Now, in the frameworks that we have, we need, I insist, to create a comprehensive system of development. It was already mentioned by Professor Rios. She said that one of the trends is to allocate more resources, the state and private initiative in the research and development of drugs. And for this, it is necessary once again to consider that our country, we have a law that establishes the obligation for the Mexican state to allocate 2% of the GDP for research and development. And we have not complied with this despite the law. So I think it is necessary then greater attention on the part of the state or government, and considering research and development are fundamental leverages for development and a very important element in health, public health policies. But as I tell you, though, that is to come. News, the news yesterday, for example, was that there is already a new project for the regulations of CONACYT, which is one of the links of the research and development system. So we'll see how it comes. So there are some changes, and we hope those changes will not be like the law of industrial property. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your participation once again for this talk. It's a very transcendental topic and generates lots of debate. We're still having some questions related to, there are some terms and even confusion. We've also said that intellectual property is a human right. It is important to accept that the intellectual property is not a human right, but we then have to reread what the Universal Human Rights Letter, which if intellectual property were a human right, it would not be a property of companies, because companies use this. So we've tried to see some cases sort of like a conflict. So there are some tensions or stress, there are some barriers, and intellectual property in some occasions may be a barrier. It's not something that is finished or extinguished. Now it's necessary that each and every country would appropriate this and would involve policies of science and technique and international positions of uh, intellectual property in the international community. We have only one path: solidarity, multilateralism. We cannot be talking about sovereignty in drugs. It can exist, yes, but we have to think of humankind as a race and our own development and our condition as human beings. It's not possible to think of a right to health without having safe medicine, a system that would be accessible and essentially something that can be paid for every one of the sectors. So I think it is important to consider this phrase that I really like in particular by Richard Buxman that says, do not try to change a system, build a new one that make the previous one to be obsolete. That's the fundamental idea that we have to follow, or we still have some questions. We cannot due to time issues. We sincerely now we're extended with the time, with the participation that we have. Nevertheless, we would like to give the floor to the president of Inter-American Commission and the American Commission Legal and Social, Dr. Hector, who's going to give us some words on this webinar that we have developed as part of the activities that our commission is developing in the legal and social scope. Thank you very much. Hello, how are you? First of all, I would like to thank the speakers that have come to talk to us some very important arguments and relevant arguments about a core topic in our reality in our countries, particularly in the context of the sanitary emergency that we're facing. It is pretty clear that our speakers today distinguish us not only by their background and experience, which is already credited here, but also because they have reflected a very didactical clarity that we really appreciate because it gives us light in these reflections that are common to all of us. And I have to say also that I find it worrying the arguments and the optimistic tone that you try to talk to us with. At some moments it's a loss before a reality that says that in 2012 WHO had a study and we still after 8 years continue to discuss this, and I think I coincide with Dr. Rius and Juan. It's late for us to see what we're going to how we're going to manage the vaccines against COVID. So what it seems that we're seeing in the media, what is happening is that countries that give resources and have a greater interest in the development of new drugs, they're acting as individual actors, far from collegiate schemes or solidarity schemes. And building that is far from us now. And I believe that this is why this commission considers this pretty important to discuss about this, what Dr. Becerra has told us about the role of international organizations and the possibilities that we have, and he has also warned us in the case of Mexico of these uh, problems we have to allocate the resources for research and development. So I think that the people that are in this webinar, we have very important reflections and lessons. To me, the seminars that I enjoy the most are the ones that make me ask rather than give me answers or certainties. And now we have several questions. One of those is what can we do in order to build in the framework of our societies to build a consensus in order to have access to drugs from others' perspective. And I will quote Noam Chomsky. We have sense, we need to have sense to build consensus. So I think this is one of the important topics in the way we are processing as societies, the building of a legal framework, not only legal, but also political framework, because we have to think of international right. When they say they leave the WHO in the United States, not everything agrees with the description of the agreements. But even there, which is the possibility of advancing importantly in order to get, at least in the case of this emergency that we face, a timely answer. I think it is clear that what previous experience show was like the H1N1 or HIV or Ebola or SARS that were solved due to other circumstances, but unfortunately, it was pretty difficult that the whole society would have an articulated and timely answer in the terms of the discussion that we had today. So I think it has been pretty interesting. Of course, to us in the commission, we really thank the CISS and the speakers that I believe have talked about relevant aspects. And of course, there are many topics to discussion because why? All the countries that have the possibility that was said by Dr. Becerra, 70% of the topic of the pharmaceutical industries in Europe and the United States, which is a gigantic proportion. They are all looking for agreements because behind these vaccines are placing resources because they want to be a priority. So this is a delicate topic. So it has an incidence from, in the design and building of the regulational national frameworks. And in there, it is clear to me, at least in the case of Mexico, that we are in reverse roads, not very consistent to an objective that may be the accessibility and creation of new medicine. So I really celebrate this seminar where we are starting with, and we're searching to have a greater vinculation, a continental dialogue, have a greater participation. We will sure have these speakers back so that they will enlighten us with their knowledge and experience. But thank you for your presence, those that see us and listen to us, and our commitment to generate with the support of Jorge and Laura, new seminars or webinars where we will be able to bring some other arguments in order to contrast them and trying to look for a solution that should be, and I repeat, and I go to Chomsky's definition, the possibility to have consensus in the fundamental so that people in our societies may have access to drugs for all diseases, but in our particular case now to try to look for a solution for the planet. I thank you for your contributions today. Thank you very much. You've been very kind. Thank you very much, Dr. Hector. We also add to the congratulations and the commitment to have them back again. It'll be a pleasure. We have to build consensus as the president of our commission calls us. And this new already mentioned, and in order to comply with the mandate of the member countries of the CISS, in order to promote well-being and without having trouble with access to health and the right to health, to remind you of the possibility to send your questions concretely to our mail of our coordinator, laura.vidal@cis-bienestar.org. So we'll give the floor to Laura in order to conclude with this event. Thank you very much, Doctor. I would only like to thank the speakers for their presentations, pretty interesting ones. Give us some more questions, as our president, Dr. Santana, says. Especially my thanks to the members of this commission. Definitely, there are great social and economical differences that we have all over America, and that we now, in this pandemic situation, we have to consider them on a daily basis. The debate that we have is complex, but it's a problem that we've been having for a long time. And nowadays, due to the situation, is enlightened. But we have great problems with the access to medicines in general for diabetes or any other chronic disease. And as it was well said by George, we have the problem or the opportunity, I would rather see it as an opportunity, to cope with this problem that we have with the vaccine and the options that we have, as said by Dr. Hoodit, these 4 vaccines that are already in the last phases of research, and that they grant us the possibility to, like in a few months or maybe next year, we'll be able to assess the situation. But as it was said, there are strategies that are now currently, we have to look for a way to have access to these drugs, not only to wait until the vaccine is in the market and then open our eyes and see how we can face our reality. I believe this space that is given by the center and the conference it gives us the opportunity to exchange and discuss ideas and exchange experiences that we've all had with the collaboration of experts in regarding the matter. So thank you very much, Dr. Manuel Becerra. Thank you very much, Dr. Judith Rios, and thank you, Dr. Herman Velasquez, who's not in here now, but we thank you anyway. So I thank you myself, and on behalf of our director, Dr. Daisy Corrales Diaz, I thank you for participating, and the people in the audience. Thank you very much. You can send us all of your comments, as said by Jorge, and we invite you next July the 16th, Thursday, the next webinar that we'll have for the elderly population, that will talk about elderly people in homes before the COVID-19 pandemics. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.